Are you experiencing a lack of work, whether that be lack of employed work or lack of work as a freelancer? If you are, stay tuned. We're going to look at 4 tips to manage our well-being. But before that, let's look at why having a lack of work can really impact our well-being. We can all suffer with a lack of work at any time, especially in the freelance world. But before we kind of get into it, it's really important that if you're struggling with finances, do seek financial advice. But now let's look at why does a lack of work impact our mental health and well-being. So why does a lack of work impact our well-being and mental health? It's because of something called the scarcity principle. So this is, if any resource becomes scarce, it becomes the centre of our attention. So it's what we can think about and pay attention to. It's all consuming. So do you remember the toilet roll, for example, in COVID? Because there was a lack of it. That's what a lot of people could focus on and think about, was getting the toilet roll. So it's the same principle. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes a lot of sense. So if a resource is scarce, it makes sense to focus on it. So if food was scarce, it makes sense to focus on it until you've got food. And in the short term, it can be really helpful. So if there is a lack of work and I focus on the lack of work and getting new leads, that can be really helpful. But when that lack of work goes on a long time, this principle can really impact our well-being and mental health. So it can impact our mental health because we are focusing on the lack of work rather than what we do have. And it may also mean that we don't spend time doing our hobbies and things we enjoy. So another way that the scarcity principle impacts us is that it can affect our bandwidth. What do I mean by this? So our bandwidth, we can only think of so much at one time. So we only have so much attention that we can focus on. And if all of that's taken up by the lack of work, then it can impact our decision making. And research has shown that the scarcity principle really impacts our decision making. It's thought that because we're focused on the lack of rather than opportunities or other factors, that's why it can really impact our decision making. Another way that the scarcity principle impacts our well-being is that it's been found to affect productivity. The reason behind this is that it's thought that because we're only focused on the lack of work, then we're focusing on that rather than what we're going to do for the day or other activities. And it's not saying it's easy when we've got a lack of work to focus on activities. It's understandable that the stress of that is going to really impact us. But as we're now just thinking about how it affects us, it does affect our productivity. And that can in turn make our well-being worse because then we're not doing the other things we want to be doing. And then we feel bad about that on top of everything else. Another way that the scarcity principle has been found to impact us is that when we're in that scarcity principle, so when we're focused on our lack of work, we tend to use short-term coping strategies. So what do I mean by this? So these are strategies that short-term give us a sense of relief from the distress and worry we're feeling as a result of the lack of work, but longer term, they keep things going to a degree, so they might lead to more negative impacts down the line. So this might be reaching for a bar of chocolate or avoiding doing the activity you wanted to do instead, for example. And it's not to say that those things in and of itself are bad, but if used throughout, it might kind of lead to us not using coping strategies that in the long term will be in our best interest. So it's important to know that we pretty much think that everyone's impacted by the scarcity principle. So when there's a lack of something, we are designed to focus on that. So it's not just you. But what we're going to look at is, although it's all of us and we can all be affected by it, there's been found to be things that can be really helpful in helping us to go through this. So it's not to say it's going to fix the lack of work or kind of make you feel over the moon about it, but it's going to help you to cope and get through it. So the first coping strategy to help us to get through when there's a lack of work is gratitude. So just once a day, focus on what you are grateful for. So this can be big things, it can be smaller things, like having a cup of tea. And just take a moment to focus on what you're grateful for. It's not saying it's going to fix everything, but being grateful has been found to be linked to increased well-being and mental health. But in relation to the scarcity principle, so that when there's a lack of something, it can really help to focus on what you do have as well as what you don't have. So it can help you to make more accurate decisions as well. top tip number 2 might sound cheesy, but it's being kind to yourself. So being kind to ourselves, again, has been linked to improved mental health and well-being. So what does this mean? What does this look like? So when there's a lack of work, it can be quite easy to get into negative self-talk. So why am I here? I'm sure other people don't go through this. So try to remind yourself that most people experience a lack of work at some point in their lives. And a really great question is to ask, what would I say to someone else if they're going through the same thing? So if someone else was experiencing a lack of work, how would I approach it? And this can challenge that negative self-talk. So top tip number 3 is to notice where your attention is. And this is a lot easier said than done. But one of the things you can do to start this is just take a moment to think about what you can see, hear, smell, touch, taste. So what this will do is it will bring you to the presence of where you are now. And that will mean that you have a bit of a breather from focusing on the lack of work. That will give you a bit more bandwidth, hopefully, to think about things. So a Harvard study found that when we focus on one possibility very intently, other possibilities go completely unnoticed. So as discussed earlier, we only have so much bandwidth. So if we're focused on a lack of work, we might completely not notice other possibilities to this. And it's really hard to focus on other possibilities. But it can be good to ask yourself questions like, what would I be doing right now? If I did have money and endless resources, what would I be doing? That might start to help to shift your attention to possibilities. And again, it's not to say that the lack of work, that you might not be able to do anything about it. But what this of focusing of where your attention is can really do, and why it's really helpful, is it's starting to help so you can choose where your attention is. Top tip number 4 is to try to focus on coping strategies that will help you in the long term. So when you do something to help you cope, think, will this really help me in a year's time? Would I be grateful that I did this right now? That can help to see if the things you're doing to cope will help you in the long term. So as we've talked about today, a lack of work is understandably really hard. It's going to cause stress and worry and cause us to focus on the lack of work. Short term, that can be really helpful. But because of the scarcity principle, if this goes on long term, it can really affect our decision making and really impact our well-being. So we've just looked at some coping strategies. So this has included being grateful, being kind to ourselves, looking at where our attention is and focusing on long-term strategies. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe.